The summer air in Alabama hung thick with the scent of magnolia and the distant hum of cicadas, the kind of heat that made the world feel slow and heavy, pressing down like an invisible hand. Evelyn Whitmore sat in the back of her father's Chevrolet, her white-gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blurred trees rushing past the window. She had just returned from college in New York, where the world felt wide and different, where the rules she had always known seemed distant, almost laughable. But back here, in her father's town, those rules were not just real, they were the law. Outside, beyond the safety of the car, she saw them, the separate water fountains, the signs above shop doors, the faces turned away whenever a white man walked by. She had known these things all her life, but after being away, they felt sharper now, more violent, more wrong. It was at the farmer's market that she saw him for the first time. Isaiah Carter stood behind his father's stall, tall and steady, his dark skin gleaming under the ruthless sun. He was selling peaches, their golden skins glistening, his hands moving swiftly as he bagged them up for the customers who barely looked at him. But Evelyn looked. She didn't know why, not at first, but something about the quiet way he carried himself, the careful way he met the eyes of those who dared glance his way, intrigued her. When she stepped forward, he hesitated, his deep brown eyes flickering with something unreadable, something cautious. "How much for the peaches?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He didn't speak right away. He studied her, and in that instant, she felt the weight of it, the absurdity of a white girl talking to a black man like this, like they were just people, like there weren't invisible walls pressing in from all sides. 3 cents a pound, miss," he finally said, his voice even, carefully measured. She fumbled in her purse, but as she handed him the coins, their fingers brushed, and for the briefest moment, time seemed to stutter. It was nothing. And yet, it was everything. Days passed, then weeks. They saw each other again, not by accident, not entirely. At the market, at the edge of town, in places where no one was looking. Their conversation started brief, clipped, but grew longer, warmer. He told her about his dreams, about how he wanted to leave, to see something beyond this town that had already decided who he was allowed to be. She told him about New York, about books and music, and how she hated the quiet obedience expected of her. Their hands brushed more often. Their eyes lingered longer. They knew the risk. They knew what would happen if anyone saw them, if anyone even suspected. But the pull between them was stronger than fear. One night, they met by the river, the moonlight turning the water to silver. "Evelyn," he said, her name feeling like something sacred on his lips. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of him. "We can't keep doing this," he whispered, but his hand found hers, his fingers trembling. "Then tell me to stop," she breathed. He didn't. The first time he kissed her, the world around them disappeared, just for a moment, just long enough to believe that love could be louder than hatred. But reality came crashing down too soon. They were seen. A boy from town, someone who knew Evelyn's father, had followed her that night, had watched them in the darkness by the river. The whispers spread like wildfire. By morning, Isaiah's father's stall was overturned, the peaches crushed beneath boot heels, a warning. By afternoon, his mother wouldn't let him leave the house, her eyes wild with terror. And by nightfall, Evelyn's father was waiting for her in the parlor, his face a mask of cold fury. "Tell me it isn't true," he said, his voice a low, dangerous thing. But she couldn't lie. She wouldn't. The slap came hard and fast, the sting blooming across her cheek. "You've disgraced this family," he hissed, and the next morning, he locked her in her room, the windows nailed shut. Across town, Isaiah was running. His mother pressed money into his hand, begged him to leave, to disappear before it was too late. "They'll come for you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You know they will." And she was right. The men came that night, torches in their hands, ropes at their sides. Isaiah ran, slipping through the trees, through the night, through the suffocating grip of a town that wanted him dead. But he had to see her. Just once more. And somehow, Evelyn escaped, too, barefoot and breathless as she ran through the streets, her heart pounding like a war drum. They met at the train station, the last place anyone would expect. He grabbed her hand. "We have to go. Now!" But she hesitated. "Isaiah, if I leave, I can never come back." He cupped her face, his thumb brushing the bruise on her cheek, his eyes burning with something desperate, something raw. "Then don't!" The train whistle screamed. The footsteps of the men hunting him grew louder. And in that moment, between love and fear, between life and death, she made her choice. She gripped his hand tighter, her breath shuddering as she stepped forward, closer to the train, closer to the unknown. But then, shouting, the sound of boots pounding against the platform, the glow of lanterns cutting through the night. Isaiah turned first, his instincts sharpened by a lifetime of knowing when danger was coming, but it was too late. Evelyn's father was there, his face twisted with fury, his hand reaching for her, and behind him, the men, the same men who had overturned Isaiah's father's stall, the same men who had set fire to houses just like his for less. "Step away from her, boy," one of them spat, his hand hovering over the gun at his hip, his voice thick with something cold, something final. Isaiah didn't move. He knew there was no winning this, but he wouldn't run. Not this time. Evelyn's fingers dug into his arm, her body pressing against his like she could shield him, like her presence alone could stop the inevitable. "No," she said, her voice sharp, wild. "We're leaving." Her father grabbed her wrist, yanking her back with enough force to make her stumble, and for a moment, Isaiah saw something flicker in her eyes, pain, fear, something breaking. He reached for her, but then came the first blow. A fist slammed into his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs, sending him to his knees. He gasped, his vision spinning, the sound of Evelyn screaming somewhere above him. Hands pulled at his shirt, dragged him to his feet. Another hit, and another, and the train whistled again, drowning out the sounds of his body hitting the wooden platform. "Stop!" Evelyn shrieked, clawing at her father, at the men, at anyone who would listen, but no one did. Isaiah tasted blood, warm and metallic on his tongue, and still he fought to stand, to move, to reach her. The train began to pull away. His only way out. His only chance. And then came the gunshot. The sound cracked through the night like lightning, sharp and merciless. For a moment, the world froze. The men stopped. Evelyn's breath hitched, her body going rigid, and Isaiah staggered, his hand pressing to his side, where warmth spread fast beneath his fingers. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and in that instant, everything they had fought for, everything they had risked, crumbled. He fell to his knees, his vision darkening, the weight of his body suddenly unbearable. Evelyn broke free, falling beside him, her hands pressing against the wound, her sobs shaking through her entire body. "No, no, no, Isaiah, stay with me," she begged, her voice cracking, her hands slick with his blood. His fingers brushed against her cheek, smearing red against her pale skin. He tried to speak, but the words never came. The men watched, their faces blank, their hatred satisfied. Her father stood above them, his face unreadable, his hand shaking, but he did nothing to stop it. Evelyn clung to Isaiah, rocking back and forth, whispering his name, promising him things he would never hear, never see. The train was gone. The night was silent. And somewhere, in the distance, the world moved on, uncaring. Evelyn refused to let go. She held Isaiah's body, as though her touch alone could keep him here, as though the warmth of her hands pressing against his blood-soaked shirt could undo what had been done. The men stood back now, their job finished, their faces cold and distant, some of them shifting uncomfortably, while others looked on, with quiet satisfaction. Her father loomed over her, his expression a mask of something unreadable. Was it regret? Was it relief? It didn't matter. She turned her face up to him, her eyes burning with a fury unlike anything she had ever known. "You killed him," she whispered, her voice hoarse, broken. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth was all around them, bleeding into the cracks of the wooden platform, sinking into the night like a secret that would never be buried deep enough. Isaiah's breath was coming in shallow, uneven gasps. His fingers twitched against her arm. He was still here. Barely. She pressed her forehead to his, rocking him slightly, whispering his name over and over again like it was a prayer. "Stay with me," she pleaded, but he was slipping, his eyes fluttering, his body too weak to fight anymore. "Evelyn," he rasped, his voice so quiet she had to lean closer just to hear him. "I wanted," he coughed, his body shaking. "I wanted to take you away." Her throat closed, the pain unbearable. "We can still go," she lied, her tears mixing with his blood, staining her face, her dress, her hands. He tried to smile, but it was barely there, just the ghost of something lost too soon. Then his body sagged against hers, his chest stilling, the last breath leaving his lips like a whisper swallowed by the wind. Evelyn let out a sound that was not human, a raw, guttural wail that cut through the night, piercing through the darkness, through the trees, through the hearts of those who still had one. The men began to move then, some turning away, some muttering to themselves, as if they had done nothing more than put down a rabid dog. Her father stepped back, looking at his hands like they were foreign things, like maybe, just maybe, he hadn't expected it to go this far. But Evelyn didn't care. She didn't care about any of them. She rocked Isaiah's body, her fingers gripping the fabric of his torn shirt, her mind refusing to accept what was real. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. She didn't know. The world had stopped. Then hands were on her, pulling her away. She fought them, kicking, screaming, her nails raking against skin, but they were stronger, too many, dragging her back, prying her fingers away from the only man she had ever loved. She was thrown into the back of a car. The door slammed. The tires crunched against the dirt road as they pulled away from the station, from his body, from everything. "You will forget him," her father said, his voice hollow, distant. "You will never speak of him again." Evelyn turned to him slowly, her face streaked with blood and tears. "I will never forget," she hissed, her voice so full of venom that, for the first time in his life, her father looked afraid of her. The house was a prison. The doors locked. The windows nailed shut. A doctor came, spoke to her in hushed tones, gave her something that made the world blur. But she fought it. Every day she fought. She refused to eat. Refused to sleep. When they forced her to sit at the dinner table, she stared at her plate, silent, empty. She was a ghost in her own home. Months passed. The town moved on. People whispered about the girl who had lost her mind, about how a proper woman should not mourn a man like that, about how lucky she was that her father hadn't married her off yet. But she didn't care. She sat by her window, staring at the road, waiting for something that would never come. And then, one night, she ran. Barefoot, her dress torn, hair wild, she ran through the streets, past the market where they first met, past the river where they had first kissed, past the train station where he had died. She didn't stop until she reached the graveyard on the outskirts of town, where they had buried him in the part reserved for men like him, hidden, unmarked, forgotten. But she hadn't forgotten. She never would. She fell to her knees, her fingers digging into the dirt, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "I love you," she whispered, pressing her forehead to the cold earth. "I will always love you." And the wind howled in response, carrying her words into the night, carrying them somewhere far beyond this place, where maybe, just maybe, Isaiah could still hear her. Years passed. Decades. The world changed. The laws changed. But the town did not. And neither did she. She never married. Never spoke of it. Never moved on. And when she died, alone in that house filled with ghosts, they found a letter clutched in her hand, a name written over and over again in ink faded with time. Isaiah. They buried her beside him. Quietly. Without ceremony. Without flowers. Without a word. And yet, somehow, even in death, they had found their way back to each other. Decades passed, and the town hardly changed, its streets still paved with the silence of things people refused to speak about, its houses still standing like monuments to the past. New families moved in, old ones died out, but the ghosts never left. The train station where Isaiah had fallen remained, though fewer trains came now, and the platform had been rebuilt so many times that no trace of that night remained, except in the whispers, in the stories told in hushed voices when the air grew thick and heavy with summer heat. Some said that on certain nights, if you stood there long enough, you could hear a woman crying, the wind carrying her sorrow through the empty streets. Others swore they had seen a shadow linger by the edge of the graveyard, where Evelyn and Isaiah lay side by side, though no one ever dared get too close. Time had tried to bury them, just as it had buried so many others, but love, true love, the kind that defied reason, defied even death, had a way of refusing to be forgotten. In the years after Evelyn was laid to rest, the house, she had grown up and stood empty, its windows dark, its doors locked tight. Some people wanted to tear it down, erase the shame, the scandal, the reminder of what had happened, but something always stopped them. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was the lingering presence of a woman who had never stopped waiting for the man she loved. It wasn't until the late 1990s that someone finally bought the house. A young couple from out of town, unaware of the stories, unaware of the past. They moved in with bright eyes and open hearts, ready to make it their own, to fill its empty rooms with laughter, with warmth, with something new. But from the moment they stepped inside, they felt it, the weight of something unseen, the hush that filled the air like an unspoken warning. The wife, Julia, found it first. A box, hidden behind loose floorboards in what had once been Evelyn's bedroom, covered in dust and time. Inside were letters, dozens of them, ink-faded but words still clear, each one addressed to Isaiah. Some were never sent, others had been returned, marked with cruel red stamps that declared them undeliverable, unwanted. She read them all, sitting on the floor as the late afternoon sun slanted through the window, painting golden streaks across the words of a woman who had spent her life speaking to a ghost. And then, at the very bottom, she found something else. A photograph, black and white, edges curled with age. It was of a young woman with soft curls and sad eyes, standing beside a man with dark skin and a quiet, steady gaze. They were not holding hands, not touching, but the way they looked at each other said everything. Julia traced the image with her fingertips, feeling a shiver dance up her spine. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay beside her husband, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe around her. And then she heard it, a whisper, faint as wind, drifting from the hallway. She sat up, heart pounding, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw her. A figure standing in the doorway, bathed in moonlight, her dress billowing slightly, as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her face was shadowed, but Julia knew. She knew. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The next morning, Julia drove into town, letters and photograph in hand, searching for someone, anyone, who could tell her the truth. She found an elderly woman sitting outside the general store, her skin weathered by time, her eyes sharp with memory. When Julia showed her the photograph, the woman went still. "Evelyn," she murmured, almost to herself. "And Isaiah." She looked up then, her gaze meeting Julia's. "You found them." And then she told the story. of love that had defied every rule, of a town that had tried to erase them, of a woman who had spent her life mourning a man they had stolen from her. Julia listened, her heart aching, her hands trembling as she traced their names, whispered them into the air like a prayer. That evening, she returned to the house, stepping carefully through its quiet halls, through its history, through its grief. And then, gently, she placed the photograph on the mantel, where the light of the setting sun could reach it, where they could be seen. That night, she dreamed of a train station bathed in moonlight, of a man and a woman standing on the platform, their hands finally clasped, their faces finally at peace. And when she woke, for the first time since moving in, the house felt lighter. As if, at last, after all these years, they had found their way home. Julia couldn't shake the feeling that she had become part of something bigger than herself, that she had stepped into a history still breathing beneath the walls of the house, lingering in the air like the faint scent of something lost long ago. She found herself drawn to the graveyard at the edge of town, where the trees stood tall and silent, their gnarled roots twisting through the earth as if gripping secrets too painful to release. The headstones were worn, many barely legible, names eroded by rain and time, but she knew where to look. She had traced the path in her dreams, the vision of them on the platform pulling her forward, whispering her name through the rustling of leaves. And then she found them. Evelyn and Isaiah, buried side by side, no grand markers, no flowers, just two simple stones barely visible beneath the overgrowth. She knelt, fingers brushing the cold surface, heart pounding in her chest. "You're not forgotten," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind, but the moment the words left her lips, something shifted, something small, something she might have imagined, a breeze stirring through the trees, a hush falling over the cemetery as if, for the first time in decades, the earth itself was listening. From then on, she visited often, learning their story piece by piece, talking to anyone who still remembered, piecing together the fragments of a love that had been stolen, buried, left to decay beneath the weight of history. She found old records, crumbling newspaper clippings, letters tucked away in attics and forgotten drawers. And with each discovery, she felt the house changing around her, the air growing lighter, the silence no longer oppressive but peaceful, like a long-held breath finally released. But then the dream started. Vivid, haunting, pulling her deeper into the past. She saw Evelyn standing by her window, staring out at the road, waiting for someone who would never come. She saw Isaiah's hands, strong and steady, fixing a loose board on the platform, his back straight even as the weight of the world pressed down on him. And then she saw the night he died, the glow of lanterns, the angry voices, the way Evelyn fought, the way Isaiah looked at her, not with fear, but with love, even as they tore him away. Julia woke gasping, the images burning behind her eyes, her chest aching as if she had been the one to lose him. And then, one night, she saw something new. A train, steam billowing in the cold night air, a figure standing alone on the platform, dressed in white, her curls falling over her shoulders, her face turned toward the tracks as if waiting, always waiting. And then, out of the shadows, another figure emerged. Tall, strong, familiar. Isaiah. She watched as Evelyn turned, saw him, her eyes widening, her hands trembling as she reached for him. And this time, he did not disappear. This time, they met in the middle, hands clasping, bodies pressing together in an embrace that had taken a lifetime to reach. When Julia woke, tears wet on her cheeks, she knew. It was over. Not in a tragic way, not in a way that left something unfinished, but in a way that felt whole, complete. She rose before the sun, dressed quickly, and walked through the quiet streets to the graveyard. She brought flowers this time, not out of sorrow, but out of peace. And when she placed them between the two graves, she whispered, "You're together now." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves, stirring her hair, and for a moment, just a moment, she could have sworn she heard laughter, soft and distant, carried away on the breeze. She closed her eyes, let it wash over her, and when she turned to leave, the sun was rising, spilling golden light over the town, chasing away the shadows. The house remained standing for many years, but it was never the same. It was lighter, warmer, filled with a kind of quiet that spoke not of grief, but of love that had finally found its way home. And those who walked past in the evenings, when the sky turned soft with twilight, sometimes said they saw them, a woman in a white dress, a man with a steady gaze, standing on the porch together, hands intertwined, watching the world move forward, finally at peace. Years passed, and the town changed, slowly but surely, the way all places do when time insists on moving forward. The old train station was finally torn down, replaced with something modern, something without ghosts, but the land still seemed to hum with memory, as if the past had seeped into the soil itself. The house, the one that had kept their love trapped between its walls for so long, remained standing, though it passed from owner to owner, none staying for very long. Some claimed the floors creaked too much at night, others swore they heard whispers when the wind pressed against the windows, but Julia knew the truth. She had stayed long enough to understand that the house was not haunted in the way people feared. It was simply filled with love too strong to be forgotten, a presence that lingered not in sorrow, but in remembrance. She had done what she could, told their story to anyone who would listen, written it down in old journals she left behind when she finally moved away. It wasn't that she wanted to leave. She loved the town, the quiet of it, the weight of history woven into every street, but something in her heart told her she had done her part, that her place was elsewhere now. She moved to the city, where the buildings touched the sky and no one knew her name, where she could start again without the burden of ghosts pressing against her shoulders. But even there, she could not forget them. The dreams still came, not as nightmares now, but as glimpses of something warm, something full of light. She saw them dancing in a place where time did not exist, saw Isaiah laughing as Evelyn spun in circles beneath a sky that never darkened, saw them in a way she had never seen them in life, free. And she knew, without a doubt, that they had finally found what had been stolen from them. She returned only once, years later, when she was old, when her hair had turned silver and her hands trembled with the weight of time. The town had changed even more by then. New buildings, new people, but the ghosts were still there, woven into the fabric of the place. She visited the graveyard first, tracing their names with fingers that had grown fragile, whispering to them one last time. Then she walked to the house, expecting it to feel different, expecting it to feel empty without her, but it was the same. The door still creaked, the air still carried that familiar warmth, and for a moment, she could almost hear Evelyn's voice drifting through the hallways, laughter mixing with the echoes of the past. And then, just as she turned to leave, she saw them. Not fully, not in the way one sees things in the waking world, but in the way one sees memories. Standing on the porch, just as she had always imagined, hands clasped, eyes bright, whole. And for the first time in her long life, she felt no sadness, no longing, only peace. She nodded to them, a silent farewell, and when she walked away, she did not look back. The house stood for a few more decades before it was finally taken down, replaced with something new, something modern, something without history. But those who built on the land sometimes spoke of strange things, of the sound of laughter on still nights, of the warmth in the air that never seemed to fade, of a feeling, soft and unshakable, that love, true love, never really leaves. Even as the town evolved, stretching toward modernity with new roads and gleaming storefronts, the land where the house once stood remained inexplicably untouched. The developers tried, plans were drawn, foundations were laid, but every project seemed to falter before completion, as if something unseen refused to let the past be buried beneath glass and steel. Some said it was coincidence, others whispered of curses, but those who had lived there long enough knew better. The ground held memories too strong to be erased, roots too deep to be severed. Julia had long since passed by then, her story fading into the background like so many others before it, but her journals remained. Tucked away in the town's small historical society, buried among old records and forgotten letters, they waited for the right hands to find them. And one day, someone did. A young woman, drawn to the town by forces she couldn't explain, stumbled upon them while researching a project on local history. She sat for hours, poring over Julia's careful handwriting, tracing the arc of Evelyn and Isaiah's love through pages that pulsed with longing, grief, and an aching hope that refused to die. She became obsessed, visiting the land where the house had stood, standing beneath the old trees, as if expecting to hear their voices carried by the wind. And maybe she did. Maybe it was just her imagination, or maybe, in places where love has burned bright enough, the echoes never truly fade. She couldn't let the story die, not after everything they had endured. So she wrote, about Evelyn's defiance, about Isaiah's quiet strength, about the night that had stolen them from each other, and the years that had failed to keep them apart. She published the book, never expecting it to find more than a handful of curious readers, but something about the story struck a nerve. People read, they shared, they wept for a love that history had tried to erase. Strangers came to the town, searching for the traces of a past that refused to be forgotten. The graveyard saw more visitors than it had in years, flowers appearing between their headstones from people who had never known them, but somehow mourned them just the same. And somewhere, in the quiet places where time folds in on itself, where the past and present brush against each other like fingertips in the dark, Evelyn and Isaiah stood together, watching, knowing that finally, the world had not forgotten. And though they had long since stepped beyond the bounds of time, their love remained, woven into the land, into the air, into the hearts of those who still dared to listen. The book became more than just a story, it became a movement. Schools began teaching it. Its pages passed between hands that had never known Evelyn and Isaiah but felt their love as if it were their own. Activists spoke their names in marches, artists painted their faces on murals, lovers traced their words on letters meant for those they could not have. The town, once content to forget, now held their story close, preserving the graveyard, protecting the land where the house once stood. No one built on it. No one dared. It became a garden instead, a place where wildflowers grew untamed, where people came to sit in silence, to feel something they could not quite name. The past, it seemed, had found a way to live on, to whisper its truths through the rustling trees, through the shifting light, through the voices of those who refused to let history erase what had been. The woman who had written their story returned often, never speaking, only listening, only watching. She would walk among the flowers, fingers brushing against petals, as if she might feel the echo of Evelyn's hands, the warmth of Isaiah's touch. And sometimes, on the stillest nights, when the moon hung heavy and the wind barely stirred, she swore she saw them. A glimpse at the edge of her vision, a woman in white, curls spilling over her shoulders, her eyes full of something both sorrowful and serene. A man beside her, his hand in hers, standing tall, unbroken. They never spoke, never moved toward her, only watched, only lingered, as if waiting for something only they could understand. And then, as quickly as they came, they would be gone, fading into the night like mist dissolving beneath the first light of dawn. The woman never told anyone what she saw. Some things, she knew, were not meant to be explained. Some things were meant to be felt, carried like a quiet ember in the heart. She lived a long life, and when her time came, when she took her final breath beneath the same sky Evelyn had once watched in longing, she knew she would see them again. And she did. But this time, there was no distance between them, no lingering in shadows. This time, when she reached out, their hands met hers, warm, solid, real. And as she stepped forward, leaving behind the weight of years, she knew, with a certainty as deep as the roots beneath the earth, that love never truly dies. It waits. It endures. It finds its way home. And in the end, no matter how much time passes, no matter how many lifetimes come and go, love always, always remembers. The years passed like shifting tides, erasing some things and illuminating others, but the land where Evelyn and Isaiah once stood remained sacred, untouched by time's indifferent hands. The wildflowers that had taken root in the old garden flourished, growing in untamed abundance, their colors spilling across the earth in defiance of the past that had tried to bury them. People still came, some out of curiosity, some in search of something they could not name, and others because they had heard the whispers, the stories of two lovers who had defied a world built to keep them apart, whose love had transcended even death. The book that had resurrected them remained in circulation, passed down from hand to hand like a relic, worn and creased, pages dog-eared by those who had read it again and again, unable to let it go. Schools still taught their story, artists still painted their faces, and lovers still carved their initials beside theirs, as if etching themselves into history alongside them. And yet, despite all this, despite the reverence and remembrance, the land itself seemed to pulse with something unfinished, something waiting. Some nights, when the wind moved through the trees in a way that sounded almost like a sigh, those who visited swore they felt a presence, a lingering warmth, as if someone was there, just beyond sight, watching, waiting. And then, one autumn evening, under a sky bruised with fading light, something happened. A woman, older now, her hair silvered by time, but her spirit untouched by it, returned to the place where it had all begun. She had been the one to find their story, to bring it back to life, and now, knowing her own time was drawing near, she had come to say goodbye. She walked slowly, taking in the air, the scent of the earth, the hush of the evening settling around her like a veil. She knelt in the garden, running her fingers through the wildflowers, feeling the life that pulsed beneath her hands, and as she closed her eyes, she whispered their names. And then, something changed. The air grew still, the world seemed to hush, and when she opened her eyes, she saw them. Not as shadows, not as fleeting glimpses at the edge of her vision, but as they had been, whole, radiant, eternal. Evelyn stood beside Isaiah, her hand in his, her smile the same one that had once made him forget the danger, forget the world. Isaiah looked at her, with the same quiet devotion that had carried them through fear and fire. And as the woman watched, they turned to her, not speaking, not needing to, because the understanding was already there, woven between them like threads of gold in the fading light. They were free now. Free in a way they had never been in life, unbound by walls, by chains, by the cruel weight of history. Free to love, to exist, to be. And as the woman watched, as tears slipped down her lined face, she felt something shift within her, a peace, a certainty. The story was complete. The past had finally released them, not into oblivion, but into forever. She smiled, whispering a final farewell, and as she rose to leave, the wind stirred, carrying with it the softest sound, laughter, light and unburdened, as if after all this time, love had finally won. And then, just like that, they were gone. But not forgotten. Never forgotten. Because love like that does not fade. It does not die. It lingers, woven into the fabric of the world, waiting for those who are willing to listen. As the years continued to unfurl their relentless course, the land that had once held the memory of Evelyn and Isaiah became something more than a mere patch of earth. It was a symbol, a sacred space that people visited in reverence, not just for what had been lost, but for what had been found in the telling of their story. The garden, once wild and untamed, flourished under the watchful eyes of those who understood its significance, each bloom a testament to a love that had outlasted every obstacle, every injustice. Those who came to the site often spoke of the peace they felt there, a calm that settled over them as soon as their feet touched the soil. Some left flowers, others wrote letters, while a few simply stood in silence, taking in the quiet hum of a love that transcended time, race, and death itself. The town, which had once been so steeped in segregation, had changed in subtle ways over the decades, its people more open, more willing to confront the injustices of the past. Yet the story of Evelyn and Isaiah, a forbidden love and a world that had tried to break them, remained a powerful reminder of the battles fought not just in the streets, but in the hearts of those who had dared to love across the lines of society's harshest divisions. And the story did not end there. Those who had known Julia, the woman who had brought their love back to life, continued to speak of her with reverence. She had passed on peacefully, but her legacy lived on in the words she had written, the lives she had touched with her unyielding belief that some truths, no matter how painful, must be told. Her death marked the final chapter in the town's evolution, and with it, a shift occurred, a recognition that the old divisions, though they had deep roots, could not hold against the force of love that had outlasted them all. The people who had once turned their backs on the past now stood in the garden, hands clasped in solidarity, and the history of what had come before was no longer a thing of shame, but of strength. It was in this place, where the house had once stood, where Evelyn and Isaiah had fought for their love, that their story found its full circle. It was a story that would never truly be over, because as long as people could still remember, as long as love still had the power to defy, there would always be someone, somewhere, to carry it forward. And so, as the seasons turned, and the sun set one last time over the garden that had borne witness to so much, the air grew still. The world stood silent for a moment, as if honoring the lives that had been lived, the love that had been given, and the truth that had been laid bare. In that silence, the earth itself seemed to sigh in contentment. There were no more ghosts here, no more longing, only peace, only love, eternal and unbroken. And the last thing that could be heard, as the stars took their places in the sky, was the sound of laughter, the sound of love that had finally found its home.